Hey, hope the midterm went okay, so please remember you're reading chapter 24 for this week. Okay, that's chapter 24. So, chapter 24 is about work, and I'm going to talk about an attendant concept to that today, and that is social class, a concept we're all familiar with, although its definition, like so many definitions we've talked about this semester, can be shifty. So, social class refers to what? Well, the naive answer is income, right? How much money you make. And in Philadelphia, say today, that might mean this: a wealthy person, a member of the upper class, we might classify as someone who makes, say, several $1 million a year. Most likely their income would be derived partly from inheritance, partly from money that has been given to them, and also partly from profits derived from businesses that they own, right? Now, what we call a middle class person might make anywhere between $50,000 and say $500,000 a year. Most likely, their income would be derived from some sort of intellectual labor. Maybe at the top end, they're a stockbroker, surgeon, or some sort of lawyer, or in the middle, maybe say an engineer, and at the bottom of that scale, there would be, say a high school teacher or a nurse or a social worker or something like that. Now, what we would call a working class person would presumably be someone who performs some sort of physical labor and who would, in theory anyway, make even less money than those people listed in the categories above. But a quick look around Philadelphia in 2010, or most cities in America, will tell you that the reality behind that is actually way, way, way more complicated, right? Some of the better off people I know, for example, are skilled tradespeople, and some of the most unemployed people I know have master's degrees. And to make matters even more complicated, the archetypal, the classic working class person, right, the semi-skilled factory labor, has been replaced, in Philly anyway, which is what all those empty warehouses in Kensington are about, by the service industry worker. And service industry jobs pay so poorly that you can in some cases work full-time and remain below the poverty line, as in fact many people in Philadelphia do. So the top class that we refer to, the ownership class, as far as we can tell, has gotten wealthier, but it's increasingly tell what it is they actually own, right? Is the owner of a chain of tire factories in Mexico who lives in the U.S., part of the upper class of the U.S. or Mexico? What about the owner of a holding company that buys and sells tire companies, right? It's infinitely complicated. Now, the conclusion that I'm trying not very subtly to lead you towards is that our conventional definitions of class are increasingly inadequate. This is because they're 19th century concepts. They emerged in the 19th century for a reason, and today I'm going to try to explain to you what that reason is, okay? So, even the most egalitarian societies in the world, say the Inuit of eastern Siberia or Alaska, or say the Mbuti of Central Africa, are still in some sense hierarchical, right? That means that they're divided into groups, and some groups have more power than others, okay? Now, on the other hand, the agricultural societies that began along various river basins in Eurasia more than 5,000 years ago, we can see the rudiments of the class systems, the inequalities that are in our own society today. These class systems were like a pyramid, with the large majority of the society at the bottom, engaged in farming, a smaller group of people who were good at fighting, say, above them, and a yet smaller group of people above them who were trained to keep records and handle spiritual matters, i.e. priests, and then finally, a very tiny group at the top, usually consisting of a military strongman and his extended family. This is as true in the Fertile Crescent as it was along the Nile, as it was along the Indus, as it was along the Yellow River, as it was in the foothills of the Andes. The Vedic caste systems of northern India reflect this arrangement as much as the feudal land tenure systems of medieval Europe. Now, the catch is that these systems tend to work a lot better in the country than they do in the city. All of the cliches that many of us have heard from our grandparents or parents or whatever about, life on the farm or in the old country, wherever that is, all these cliches are what this is about. Everyone knows everyone. Informal welfare systems take over in times of hardship. The rich guy sits next to the farmhands at church once a week, blah, blah, blah. Grandpa, thanks. Anyway, for most of the last 5,000 years, cities were small, so this caveat about it working better in the country than in the city was a minor caveat. But in the 19th century, which is what we're concerned about in chapter 24, the world in many places was undergoing rapid urbanization, right? People moving to cities, cities getting bigger. In nearly every case, the cause behind this urbanization was the need for more people to operate a growing number of factories. These people came to be seen and to see themselves as a new class, industrial workers. Like the peasantry they were drawn from, they were exploited. And this exploitation is based on a simple premise, right? So you're a farmer. It takes you and your family 6 hours per day of work to provide for all of your needs, food, clothing, shelter, etc., right? But you don't own the land that you work on, someone else does. And that person makes you work 12 hours per day. So only half of your labor is going to your own needs. Where's the other half going? Well, it's going to the guy that owns the land that you work on, and what's he doing with it? He might be selling it, he might be consuming it himself. The bottom line is, though, he is accumulating the surplus created by you, okay? Now, out on the farm, there are limits to how much surplus can accumulate. For starters, there's only so much land. For another thing, the traditional relationship between the lord and the peasant is not based on mutual convenience, right? They are bound to each other. According to the age-old custom in most parts of the world, the lord can exploit the hell out of the peasant family, but he's also, at the end of the day, responsible for them in some sense. He can't simply tell them to go away or let them starve to death if it happens to be a bad year on the farm. But take the peasant family off the farm and make them factory workers. Take the lord out of his estate and make him a factory owner. The relationship changes. The factory workers are now no longer bonded to give their labor to their lord for life. Now instead, they're wage laborers. They're selling their labor on a contract basis to their employer, the factory owner, right? So that's an improvement, right? I mean, they're free. If they don't like the conditions in one factory or the wages, they can go sell their labor in another, right? These are precisely the conditions in which hundreds of millions of farm workers, mainly but not exclusively in Europe and North America, uprooted themselves from village life and transported themselves to cities in the early 19th century. But in practice, they experienced very little of the freedom that I described a moment ago. In theory, wage workers can withhold their labor until someone makes a better offer. In practice, these workers, like you and I, need to eat every single day. In theory, owners have to compete with each other for workers by providing better work conditions and wages. In practice, however, workers were competing with each other. Typically, whether in Europe or America, owners were able to depress wages by bringing in new groups that had previously been excluded from the labor force, right? Sometimes this meant women. Sometimes this meant new immigrants. Sometimes in the case of America, it meant recently freed slaves. Now, in theory, workers would recognize this as a divide and conquer strategy. In practice, they resulted in riots, hence the nativist riots, they were called, that took place throughout the 19th century in every major American city, Philadelphia included, on 4th Street, actually. Finally, it wasn't merely demand for labor that determined wages, it was demand for goods that the workers were producing. If demand went down, wages went down. And that is precisely what happened, first in the 1830s, then in the 1870s, and then in the 1890s. And in the 19th century, bear in mind, there was nothing other than private charity for unemployed workers to fall back on. Bear in mind, most of our contemporary sanitation that we take for granted in a city, now this means waste removal, it means provision of clean water, clean air. This was all developed while this process of urbanization was going on, not beforehand, right? These urban workers didn't move to ready-made clean cities. As a result, the workers' quarters of 19th century cities were, by our standards, a nightmare. Horrid smells, horrid sounds, families living stacked on top of each other in tenements, open sewers, skies black with pollution, periodic fires, outbreaks of cholera, and worse. Now imagine what happens when a wave of unemployment hits one of these communities that I just described. There are no food stamps. There are no unemployment benefits. The elaborate systems of voluntary social welfare that had developed over 1,000 years in the villages that these people's parents or grandparents had come from, these systems were a distant memory. In general, the only consolation available in hard times, or in good times for that matter, was alcohol, cheap alcohol, usually rum, made from sugarcane imported from the Caribbean or South America. Now, have I painted you a picture yet? I'm trying to. Now, this is not to say that the life of the traditional European peasant had been any better. In fact, in many cases, it was probably worse. But the difference is that whereas the European peasant, isolated in the countryside, legally for all intents and purposes a slave, bound by age-old social conventions and customs, this person suffered in silence. The urban industrial worker had been, socially anyway, cut loose, and as a result, could often be quite volatile. So this new group of people came to be regarded, as I said, and to regard themselves as a new social class, the industrial worker. And quickly, this became a political identity. This was the beginning of the labor movement. And the major conflicts that defined Europe after 815 ceased to be conflicts between states or religious conflicts within Europe, and they began to be conflicts between this new class of industrial workers and, well, basically everyone else. In England, this took the form of the Chartist movement, which resulted relatively peacefully in major workplace reforms, with a few exceptions. In 1848, however, on the continent, it very nearly resulted in the overthrow of several of the biggest governments in Europe. In 1871, in Paris, it led to the establishment of the Third Republic. These were enormous social movements that were often very violent. Now, at every stage, these conflicts were resolved by buying the workers off a little more, each time a little more, with better living conditions, higher wages, more sophisticated entertainment, and amenities, right? Leisure, in other words, the notion of leisure. Now, this was all very expensive, and in retrospect, the bill was not being footed by the employers, who still barely paid taxes in the 19th century. It was paid for directly and indirectly through the colonial ventures of the countries in which these workers lived, right? And at the same time this is happening, national identities. I'm French, I'm German, I'm British, I'm American, this means something. These national identities were becoming stronger and stronger amongst the working classes. Thus, as the century progressed, nationalism, imperialism, and the labor movement became more and more closely intertwined. And although no one would realize the full implications of this until 1914, when war, after a century, returned to European soil with a vengeance. Okay, thanks very much.